Alright, Standard 19C, we're going to talk about several things actually. But 19, the student will identify major developments of World War II. That's what we want to look at. Major events in World War II. 19C says explain major events including the Lend-Lease program, the Battle of Midway, D-Day, and the fall of Berlin. So we have four things here we have to focus on. Lend-Lease program, Battle of Midway, D-Day, and fall of Berlin. So Lend-Lease program, Battle of Midway, D-Day, fall of Berlin. Four focus areas, so this is going to be a long video. The elements are those we just discussed. A conflict and compromise are the theme, and war mobilization are themes. And we're going to talk about some geography here as well. It's going to be very important. Let's talk about the Lend-Lease Act first. Lend-Lease, if you recall, Lend-Lease is going to be a cash and carry program where FDR tries his darndest and earnestly to get Congress to reverse those neutrality acts we talked about in one of our previous videos, that Congress didn't want FDR going. That was one of his international challenges. They don't want him to go and get involved in this war in Europe, so they passed these neutrality acts. There were three of them, I believe, that made it illegal to sell or make loans to nations at war. And so this is going to keep FDR from sending aid to Great Britain. And here we are, right here, isolationism. That neutrality acts, those neutrality acts are part of that, and it's going to take us. This is going to take a good deal of time to get from that. But the Lend-Lease Act was an attempt by FDR to justify aid to Great Britain, you know, and not enter the war at the same time. Before we entered the war, before Pearl Harbor was attacked, this was FDR's attempt to get the United States to lend aid to Great Britain. Okay. Alright, so let's look at what this is. 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act and amended the Neutrality Act so the United States could lend military equipment and supplies to any nation that the President said was vital to the defense of the United States. So we know they do actually pass it, but it's only 9 months before Pearl Harbor. So it's in 1941. So FDR had a time getting the United States to leave isolationism, leave neutrality, and then try to help this World War I thing. Here's a cartoon representing this. Look at this, neutrality acts. Old man of the sea. You know, FDR here is trying to get aid to Great Britain, but the old man, isolationism or neutrality, doesn't want to go. So it's going to take a while to get that Neutrality Act reversed, and eventually does get them to pass the Lend-Lease Act, which gives him the authority to send military equipment, whatever is needed, to Great Britain at a time. Let's hear what he had to say, and let's hear some of his. Here's one here, an address on September 7th, 1940. This is even before the Lend-Lease Act was passed, and a year before probably. And let's listen to what he says, why he says we need to send aid to Great Britain.
For on September 27th, 1940, this year, by an agreement signed in Berlin, 3 powerful nations, 2 in Europe and 1 in Asia, joined themselves together in the threat that if the United States of America interfered with or blocked the expansion program of these 3 nations, a program aimed at world control, they would unite in ultimate action against the United States.
And this is called the Arsenal of Democracy speech, by the way. Here's the second part.
If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe, Asia, Africa, Australasia, and the high seas, and they will be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources against this hemisphere. It is no exaggeration to say that all of us in all the Americas would be living at the point of a gun loaded with explosive bullets, economic as well as military.
All right, and he says if Great Britain goes down, that's the thing, that they'll take all of Asia, Africa, and all of Europe. And so what should we do about this? What does he say?
We should enter upon a new and terrible era in which the whole world, our hemisphere included, would be run by threats of brute force. And to survive in such a world, we would have to convert ourselves permanently into a militaristic power on the basis of war economy.
He's saying that converting to a military power is not a good thing. That's not what we want to do, not permanently, but we're going to have to do it temporarily in order to defeat this brute force. Here's the next part of it.
The people of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war, the planes, the tanks, the guns, the freighters, which will enable them to fight for their liberty and for our security. Emphatically, we must get these weapons to them. Get them to them in sufficient volume and quickly enough so that we and our children will be saved the agony and suffering of war which others have had to endure.
In other words, we need to send them all these war items to enable them to fight for their liberty and for our security so we don't have to go to war. So he's trying to convince them to send aid to Great Britain is what he's trying to do. Here's another one, part of this same speech.
In a military sense, Great Britain and the British Empire are today the spearhead of resistance to world conquest, and they are putting up a fight which will live forever in the story of human gallantry.
So here he's talking about Great Britain and the British Empire fighting against these Axis powers. So, and we need to help them. Look what they're fighting against. So here's where he brings democracy into it.
Democracy's fight against world conquest is being greatly aided, and must be more greatly aided, by the rearmament of the United States, and by sending every ounce and every ton of munitions and supplies that we can possibly spare to help the defenders who are in the front lines.
So there he says we have to start making these war goods to help out Great Britain. Here's another part of that same speech.
I want to make it clear that it is the purpose of the nation to build now with all possible speed every machine, every arsenal, every factory that we need to manufacture our defense material. We have the men, the skill, the wealth, and above all, the will. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war. We have furnished the British great material support, and we will furnish far more in the future. There will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain. No dictator, no combination of dictators will weaken that determination by threats of how they will construe that determination.
And this is the last one here.
I have the profound conviction that the American people are now determined to put forth a mightier effort than they have ever yet made to increase our production of all the implements of defense to meet the threat to our democratic faith.
Okay, so democracy's in danger, and so he's asking to help Great Britain send these materials over there. Finally, he convinces in 1941, a year later, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Congress passes the Lend-Lease Act, amends the Neutrality Acts, and then we start sending these supplies and equipment. But it was a hard fight, leaving isolationism. We're going to leave isolationism, which we do this Lend-Lease Act, in which Pearl Harbor hits and we declare a war. We have not returned back to isolationism since then. Okay. So the old man in the sea, we left neutrality behind. We start this Lend-Lease Act. So the Lend-Lease Act was where FDR was seeking public support, and he uses what's called it's called two things: the fire hose analogy or the garden hose analogy. And in this Lend-Lease Act speech, I don't have it recorded or anything, he likened it to putting out a neighbor's fire. And here's what he says: "What do you do in such a crisis?" The president asked at a press conference. "I don't say to my neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over." The fire here are these three Axis powers that are trying to take over, and by lending weapons and leasing weapons to Great Britain without making them pay for it, we thwart or do away with the ability of Germany and Mussolini and Italy to come to the United States and take over our land. That's basically what it's saying. So FDR uses this hose analogy. It's called the fire hose or garden hose analogy, also fire hose analogy. I've heard it that way before, as an attempt to justify or give justification why the United States should give aid, why we should send weapons to Great Britain, even though we hadn't entered a war. Okay, and this is before Pearl Harbor now. So that's what he gave this hose analogy for, to convince Congress. And he basically likens this garden hose analogy. Okay, here's Europe, their house is on fire, but here's us, our house is nearby. If we don't put that fire out, that fire is eventually going to come over here and burn our house down. And the analogy is, here we are in the Western Hemisphere, here they are in European and the Eastern Hemisphere. When Germany and Hitler and Mussolini and Italy and Japan get finished with them, where do you think they're coming? They're coming to us. So basically what he's saying is, when we loan weapons to Great Britain, we're helping them put out that fire before it spreads this way. And here's a cartoon showing just exactly that. Here's Europe on fire over here. Germany and all those expansive powers are burning it down. Here's FDR, and there's Congress on this guy's leg. This is Congress. Whether to amend the Neutrality Act or not. Here's the United States. So this is a little cartoon. You can kind of look at it, and it gives you great understanding of what we're talking about here. And so they passed the Lend-Lease Act and agreed to do just that, send all those military equipment that any nation needed, that the president thought needed. Okay, let's look at this. $11 billion to 1943 Lend-Lease aid, shipping and repairs, production facilities, munitions, agricultural products, industrial items of all sorts are going to be sent. Here's some little charts here. Where did the Lend-Lease goods go? Look at the United Kingdom, all these. Great Britain, that's where we really want to go. We just sent it to the Soviet Union, some to Africa and China and India and other nations, but mostly to Great Britain. Okay, here's one here, Lend-Lease food exports. Here's some of the items: meats, milks, butter, cheese, eggs. So food products to these Allied soldiers to help them stay nourished while they fight. And here's a political cartoon of the U.S. Lend-Lease. This is Dr. Seuss. See the bombs and airplane stuff coming out? This is Lend-Lease. Okay, here's some pictures. There's some tanks and weapons being sent in Lend-Lease. Here's some machine guns here being sent. Some rifles to Great Britain. And here's some women packaging up some of these food items going on a Lend-Lease program. Here's some milk. And here's some canned pork that's going to the USSR. They put this pork in these cans. They put this lard and preservatives in there with it. Okay. These are called Lend-Lease Liberators, or motorcycles that were made and sent to the Allies. And so we see a lot of material being sent to these Allied powers. The reason why not many went to France, you don't see France on there, is because it had been overtaken by Germany. We're going to talk about it. So that's the end of Lend-Lease. Let's go to the turning points of the World War II, and let's talk about those. Okay. All right. Says there's two theaters of war, and we need to talk about these. Hold on. Let's first go back and look at what we're supposed to be talking about. Explain the major events, including the Lend-Lease program. We just did that. The Battle of Midway and D-Day. Battle of Midway and D-Day, they're both turning points during World War II, and that's what we want to talk about right now. And turning points in World War II, there were two theaters of war that you need to remember. Okay, one's over in Europe. We call that the European theater, and one is the Pacific theater, which includes Japan and all the areas it took in its expansion. And out here in the Pacific Ocean, Pearl Harbor and Midway are out here in the Pacific. We're going to look at that. So if we're looking for similarities, we can say that D-Day and the Battle of Midway that we have to talk about, both of those are turning points of World War II. In other words, both of these indicate in World War II that the Allies are going to win. So we're going to look closely at D-Day and the Battle of Midway and see how they were turning points. Okay. So in the European theater over here, D-Day is going to be the turning point of the European theater. On the beaches of Normandy here, we're going to see the Allied invasion. And then over here on Midway Island, we're going to see the Battle of Midway is going to be a turning point in the Pacific theater. It's extremely important for us to understand this geography here. Here's the Pacific theater. The turning point that showed the Allies would win was the Battle of Midway there. And then D-Day, the turning point in the European theater that showed the Allies would win in Europe. Okay, so let's look at the Battle of Midway first. Let's look at that. Alright, so the turning point in World War II in the Pacific, if you look down here at these islands, these planes bombing these islands, the Battle of Midway, the United States, I try to tell my students to try to think of Midway as payback or an answer to Pearl Harbor, and Pearl Harbor is not too far away. That at Midway is where the United States did a surprise attack on the Japanese, and that in turn is going to cause this turning point to show the Allies would win. So the United States destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers while losing only 1 American carrier during this battle. And this is a surprise attack on the Japanese by the United States. Okay, and the reason why Midway here's Midway in the Pacific. Here's the Pacific theater right here. Here's Hawaii, and here's where the Battle of Midway took place, not too far. The reason why Midway is important geographically is because if Japan is going to control all this area out here in the Pacific theater and all these little islands out here, and even Hawaii if it took it over, is that it would need some way to refuel its tankers and aircraft carriers, and also it uses Midway Island as a refueling station. So once you take that refueling station, you can kind of cripple Japan and its movement throughout the islands with all this war materials. And in the Pacific Ocean, a big challenge for Japan as well as the United States was the distance you had to travel across this expansive Pacific Ocean. That was extremely difficult. That's why these islands were important. Hawaii to the United States and Midway to Japan, is that they were midway points or refueling points there, with Pearl Harbor being a military base for the United States and Midway being a refueling station for Japan. So this is why it's geographically important, the Battle of Midway. And on June 4th, 1942, the United States did a surprise attack on the Japanese there and destroyed those 4 carriers, a lot of airplanes. And it's going to be a turning point, this thing is. And after that, there's going to be island hopping all the way back to Japan. And it's going to be one Allied victory after another, all the way back to Japan. So the reason that Midway is a turning point is it is going to boost the morale of American and Allied troops. And it is a very important engagement in the Pacific because of its location we just talked about. But Japan is never going to recover from its loss and defeat at Midway. And that's going to enable the United States to get control of these other strategic islands where it can hop all the way back from Midway, Wake, Guam, Philippines, all the way back to Japan. So that's one of the reasons it's important turning point. The United States gained control of these other Pacific islands. The United States is able to overcome the geographic difficulty of resupplying its forces within the Pacific Ocean with food, medicine, weapons, and other critical supplies needed to push westward toward Japanese mainland. So it's this geographic difficulty that was overcome by defeating Midway and getting the Japanese out of the way and then taking those other strategic areas. Now the United States could resupply all the way across the Pacific, all the way to Japan, and give its troops the food and medicine supplies they needed. And the leader there was General Douglas MacArthur, and he's the guy that, with the corncob pipe and the cool sunglasses there. He's the U.S. commander in World War II and the Pacific Theater, over in the Pacific Theater. So D-Day and Midway, before we go to D-Day, which we're about to do, they have similarities in that they're both turning points. And we need to talk about this geography again with D-Day as well. Midway's geography we just discussed. Let's talk about D-Days. And remember that D-Day is the turning point in Europe. Midway is the turning point in the Pacific. And that in the Pacific, Midway was important because of this distance going across here and how each side could resupply and refuel its troops. Alright, so let's talk about D-Day. D-Day is geographically important as well. Okay, so here's why. Here's Europe that had been dominated by Hitler's troops. Okay, here's what he had taken control of. Okay, the Nazis, especially in France, look here, had taken all of France over, so the Nazis had occupied France. And the heart of Germany and Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany was Berlin, the capital here. So this is the prize. The Allies wanted to capture Berlin. So the Soviet Union wanted to capture Berlin, Great Britain, the United States, all wanted to take down Berlin, because if you could take down Berlin, you could cripple Germany and take Hitler, take him over. And so that was the prize they were looking for. But the problem was he had taken much of the heartland of Europe. Okay, most of it had been overtaken by the Nazis. And one of the reasons Germany invaded the Rhineland and then attacked the Soviet Union and went and took France first is because Germany knew from its history the worst thing that could happen to it is fight a two-front war. So if the Soviet Union's coming from this way, Great Britain and France is pushing up through this way, then it's going to cripple Germany. So that's why it did a blitzkrieg or lightning war and took over France real quick, so it wouldn't have to worry about within continental Europe have to worry about having a two-front war. But that's about to change with D-Day. So the geographic reasoning for D-Day is to try to establish a beachhead somewhere in France, out here in the British Isle or somewhere out in here. Okay, it's to establish a beachhead so that you could resupply your troops within continental Europe and push toward Berlin. That's what we're looking for. That's why it's geographically important. So D-Day, if you see this invasion here of D-Day, was the largest ever in world history. D-Day was the code name for the first day of an operation known as, the Allied operation known as Operation Overlord. That's very important. Operation Overlord, the first day, is called D-Day. Now the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France, what they wanted to do is the Allies wanted to take over France and push these Nazis back out of France and liberate France, make France free. In other words, move all this red out, move the Nazis back and push them back to Germany. That's what D-Day was about. So it's the largest seaborne invasion in history. American and British forces, Canadian forces even, were able to maintain a permanent beachhead in mainland Europe. In mainland Europe here, they're going to establish a beachhead right here, what's called the beaches of Normandy, and then they're going to make this push here, here, and here, and they're going to push these Nazis out, German Nazis out, and push them back to Berlin. That's what their focus is, to try to get that geographic important stance there, this permanent beachhead in mainland Europe. And see, these are the beaches of Normandy here where they're dumping all the soldiers and supplies off. And they were going to use that to resupply their forces and push east to Germany. So resupply their forces, that's what they were looking for, and establish this beachhead so they can resupply forces, put forces on the ground in the mainland Europe, and then push Germany east. That's what D-Day was all about. That's why it was important geographically. Here's a bigger picture of this invasion. That is crazy. Look at that, all that invasion. I'd hate to look out my window and see that coming, but anyway, the largest land, sea, air invasion, amphibious invasion ever in world history, D-Day. And so Dwight D. Eisenhower is the Allied commander, overall Allied commander, especially in Europe. He's going to oversee D-Day, and they're going to leave Great Britain here in London, moving all these troops and forces, and they're going to land here on the beaches of Normandy, and that's where they're going to establish their beachhead and their movement inward in mainland Europe to push the Nazis out of France. And here it is. Here's D-Day landing right over here, and they're going to push Nazi Germany out of there. Right. Here's a closer picture. Here shows some of the beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. That's where they named the places on the beaches here in Normandy. Here's Normandy right here in France. The 1st Division U.S., the 4th Division was U.S., Utah and Omaha. And then we see the 3rd Division was actually Canadian, Juno Beach, and then the 5th Division and 3rd Division were actually British, and they're going to land at Golden Sword, and that's where this is D-Day. This is the invasion, and this is the inland map here, shows you right there on France where it was. Very important. We look at this, and we see these allies working together on D-Day and trying to establish this beachhead, and they're actually going to do it in this huge invasion, and then they're going to start pushing these Nazis out of Germany and push them back into Germany. Here's the Nazis over here. The Allied commander of D-Day in World War II was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, right here. He's later going to be our President of the United States. So the point here was the Soviets were going to be advancing from this way. That's one front. And then by establishing a beachhead on mainland Europe, and then being able to resupply troops they're going to be pushing toward Berlin, you create this two-front war. And that's what the Allies wanted to do with the Soviet Union coming from this way and the other Allies coming from this way, is they put pressure both sides on Germany so it would split up its forces and have one on this front and have one on the eastern front and one on the western front, and that way it would weaken the German military. So we have similarities here in D-Day is a turning point. Midway is a turning point. D-Day showed that the Allies would actually win in Europe. We knew it. It's just a matter of time. Battle of Midway, same way. So we see here that D-Day is a turning point in Europe, right here in France, and Battle of Midway is a turning point in the Pacific. Alright. So here's the fall of Berlin. And what we're talking about, the fall of Berlin, is the ending of the war in the European theater. How it ends. So the fall of Berlin was one of the final battles of the European theater. It was the final battle. One of the bloodiest battles in history. And the Soviet Union is going to enter Berlin, Germany, and take Berlin, Germany, and crush it. Okay, and it's there that Adolf Hitler shoots himself and has some of his leaders burn his body. But anyway, that happened. The Germans are going to surrender on May 8th, 1945. That's called the Fall of Berlin. It's also known as VE Day. is the Victory Over Europe Day, and this is going to hit the papers. It's going to be all over the place. And when they surrender, and the war in Europe is going to end. So VE will be proclaimed today. Victory over Europe. Our troops. All right, there you go. Here's some pictures of the troops after the fall of Berlin. VE Day. Everybody was celebrating in the United States, all over Europe. And here's a painting of VE Day, May 8th, 1945. Now the war had not ended in the Pacific theater yet. After VE Day and the fall of Berlin, here, it's going to end the war in the European theater, but not the Pacific theater. So right here, let's see. So this European theater is going to end with D-Day, but not the Pacific theater. Pacific theater will not end until the United States drops 2 bombs under the command by President Truman, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then Japan surrenders later. We're going to talk about that at a different date, though. Okay. So I think we've met our objective here. I know this is a long video, but it's a lot of stuff in here. Explain major events, including the Lend-Lease program, the Battle of Midway, D-Day, those two being turning points. Midway in the Pacific turning point. D-Day is the European turning point. And then the fall of Berlin, VE Day, or Victory Over Europe. European theater comes to an end in World War II. Alright, if you have any questions, ask them in class. Watch this video over again. Good luck on the quiz. Test the EOCT.